Okay, good afternoon. It is 2 o'clock on May 14th. Today we will be going over the last 3 chapters of To Kill a Mockingbird. The last 3 chapters are fairly short, so these 3 chapters encompass, I think, about 15 pages total. So we should definitely be able to squeeze all 3 into this half-hour session. So I'll begin. If you have any questions when you show up, let me know and I'll try to answer those as best I can. I did notice that quite a few of you have been catching up on the quizzes, which is great. If you're not all the way caught up yet, that's fine. Just so long as they get done before the end of the school year. But because we'll be finishing To Kill a Mockingbird, the story at least this week, next week we should probably begin working on projects. So you can still go back and finish this work, but I won't be going over To Kill a Mockingbird after today because we should be finished. Anyways, so chapter 29 of To Kill a Mockingbird. This chapter deals with Scout explaining what had happened to the sheriff and Atticus. Up to this point, they're not really sure what's occurred. They know that Jem's arm's been broken. They know that he was attacked and that Scout was attacked. Oh, hey, Malachi, welcome. Just starting to go over chapter 29. I'm not sure how soon you arrived, but I should be able to get through the ending of To Kill a Mockingbird today. Hopefully next week we can start working on projects. If you're not caught up on the quizzes, that's fine. You have till the end of the school year. Just be aware that after today, I won't be using class time to summarize the novel, because this should probably serve as the last summary. But if you have any questions about what transpires in the chapters, feel free to ask a question either on Google Classrooms or on the side of the YouTube stream, and I'll be happy to answer those. Okay, so like I was saying, this chapter deals with Scout telling her story about what had happened. So Sheriff asks Scout to explain. Remember, Scout's still fairly young. She's like 9 or 10 years old. So as she's explaining things, it seems like she really starts to understand what had happened better. Sometimes just verbalizing what has occurred helps you think through it at a higher degree, and that definitely happens here with Scout. So Scout basically recaps what happened in chapter 28, explaining the events that occurred, the walk back, how they were attacked, how Jem's arm broke. She seems to realize the sound she heard in the scream was Jem's arm breaking. That was pretty obvious to us as we read through last chapter, but it didn't seem to click in her head until she actually verbalized it. She also realizes that it was Mr. Yule who was trying to squeeze her and that he was actually trying to kill her. He was trying to squeeze her to death, right? Just grab a hold of her and squeeze the life out of her. The fact that she was wearing that costume with all the chicken wire kind of served as armor for her almost, and that probably saved her life. She also remembers hearing someone gasping for breath, and this was likely Mr. Yule dying after he'd been stabbed. And she explains how the stranger saved Mr. Yule, saved her by yanking Mr. Yule away. And remember, she initially thinks that this is Jem who pulled Mr. Yule off. But as she's going through this, she's starting to see it was probably the stranger who pulled Mr. Yule off. She doesn't verbalize that because she still gives credit to Jem for pulling Mr. Yule off of her when he was squeezing her. But logically, that probably wasn't what happened. It was most likely the stranger, because by that point, Jem had already screamed. Jem's arm had already been broken. So it would have been really difficult for him to pick up the adult Mr. Yule, who, again, Jem's 13. Mr. Yule's a full-grown man. If his arm hadn't been broken, that would have been difficult. But with his arm broken, I mean, there's probably no way he could have done that. Anyways, as she's finishing up her story, she points out that he saved her, and then she points at the stranger in the corner. The stranger has gray, faded eyes. Scout thinks for a second that he might actually be blind. He's extremely thin. His clothes are faded, his hair's thinning, almost feathery. And then she realizes, and she starts to cry, that the person who saved her was actually Boo Radley, this person who she was so scared of and was the center of their curiosity for so many summers. Now she realizes he's the one who saved her. So she greets him as Boo. She actually says, "Hi, Boo." And that kind of shows that she's not afraid of him anymore. She does kind of bury her head on Jem to hide her face, and this is more like kind of out of like embarrassment than fear. She's not actually afraid of him from this point forward. That's the end of that chapter because it's really short. An important thing to look at in this chapter, though, is the perceptions of Mr. Yule. While Scout's telling the story, Heck and Atticus have a bit of a disagreement. Atticus suggests that Mr. Yule was out of his mind. We know that Mr. Yule had been drinking. Scout said that she could smell whiskey on him. Mr. Heck Tate just says that Mr. Yule was just a bad person. He was evil. He explains that he was a coward. He was brave enough to harass Helen, probably because he knew that Helen, being an African American, couldn't directly confront him because of the racism at the time period. And he was also brave enough to try to break into the judge's house when he thought the house was empty. As soon as he found out the judge was there, he ran away. And then he was brave enough in the dark with alcohol to attack two small children. Jem's 13, Scout's 9 or 10 at this point. So, like, 13 is not incredibly young, but that's pretty young still. I know you guys are like 14, 15, but it's still fairly young compared to like a full-grown man. Heck, Tate demonstrates more of like a jaded worldview. He just thinks that Mr. Yule was an evil person. He was a coward. He was cruel. He mistreated his family. He was lazy. He had all these negative aspects to his personality. So Heck is more than willing to just write him off as just being a bad person. Atticus, on the other hand, remember, one of the key themes that Atticus keeps bringing up is the idea that people are basically good. Once you get to know someone, you're noticed the good in that person. So with Miss DeBose, who seemed like just this mean, nasty person, it turned out she was actually very brave, so she had some positive qualities. Mr. Avery, their neighbor, who seems to just be this angry old man, he actually saves a lot of Miss Maudie's furniture during the fire, and he's literally the last person out of a burning building just trying to save something for his neighbor, right? So for the most part, most of these people in the town do have good sides to them. They do some bad things, especially with regards to racism and not standing up to confront that during the trial, but they still have some good qualities. But with Mr. Yule, it's hard to find a good aspect of his personality. He mistreats his family, he's lazy, he lies, he attacks children, he harasses the widow of Tom, so the man who he falsely accused of raping his daughter, which directly results in Tom's death. He then goes out and harasses his widow. And then he's a coward. Every time someone directly confronts him, he backs away. So Mr. Yule's kind of like got the realistic mindset, like he's looking at the world and he's using realism. Atticus is more of an idealist. He looks out at the world and he sees how he wants things to be. So he can't imagine with his worldview that someone's just bad. And he has trouble, even after this person attacked his children, to just write this person off as just being a bad person. And it says a lot about both of these characters' personalities, how Mr. Tate is more of a realist and how Atticus is more of an idealist. All right, chapter 30 is also fairly short. Chapter 30 deals with some interactions between Scout and Boo. Also, an argument between Heck Tate and Atticus. So we'll start with Scout and Boo first. Scout's really surprised by how the adults casually interact with Boo. Remember, she thinks Boo's something of a mystery, kind of like this mysterious, not quite human entity, right? Atticus definitely knows him, and when Scout calls Boo Boo rather than by Mr. Arthur, Atticus corrects her. So Atticus is so proper even in the face of this tragedy and this danger that his son has just faced, and his daughter also. He's still very proper, and he still says, no, you need to call him Mr. Arthur. When the doctor sees Boo, he's very casual and he says hi. Scout realizes that Boo must have seen the doctor before because he's gotten sick. He is a person, but she's starting to suddenly see him in the context of being a neighbor and not just being a mystery or a subject of her curiosity. She does show some growth. She's very civil to Boo. She guides him through the house. She makes sure he's comfortable on the porch when the group goes outside. The doctor kind of shoos everybody out of the room so he can tend to Jem. So Scout kind of guides Boo to the porch, and she makes sure that he has a comfortable seat on the porch as well. So she demonstrates a lot of those qualities that her aunt is trying to instill, how to actually be a lady, how to behave like a young woman. When they're on the porch, there's an argument between Atticus and Heck. If you remember previously, when Atticus has had interactions with Heck, Atticus kind of takes the lead. When there was the rabid dog, Heck asked Atticus to take care of it. When they've had conversations about, the mob possibly attacking Tom, implications about Mr. Yule maybe causing problems down the line. For the most part, Heck has always kind of taken Atticus's lead. Whatever Atticus said, Heck kind of backed him up, even though Atticus isn't, a sheriff. He's just the defense attorney. He doesn't actually have standing within the law to direct Heck around. But he still kind of defers to his judgment. But they have a pretty big argument here. Heck mentioned before that Mr. Yule was found dead and he had a knife in his chest. And now they heard the story from Scout, so they have some background as to what happened. Atticus thinks what happened during the struggle was that somehow Jem stabbed Mr. Yule. He knows Jem probably didn't have a kitchen knife with him, so it was probably Mr. Yule's knife. Somehow in the dark, he got a hold of that knife and stabbed Mr. Yule. Atticus thinks this is perfectly legal. It's self-defense, but he still wants the matter to go through the courts. He wants his son to be exonerated of the crime, but he still wants to go through that. He doesn't want Jem to just get a free ride because of who Atticus is. He doesn't want Jem to get a misconception here that everything was hushed up to protect him. Atticus isn't trying to get Jem in trouble. It's just he wants to ensure that the matter is resolved, and he doesn't want to teach Jem that he can misuse his reputation to get away with something. Just the facts, right? Atticus is missing something pretty big here. And Hecate is hoping that he catches it on his own, but he's unwilling to verbalize out loud what actually happened. So first, let's talk about Atticus's fear. So he's afraid he'd be teaching Jem a bad lesson, and this pops up quite a bit throughout the story. He doesn't want to teach Scout or Jem bad lessons. So when Jem rips up all of Miss DeBose's flowers, he wants to teach Jem about what bravery really is. It's not being destructive and standing up for yourself by destroying something. It's not shooting a dog that's rabid in the street. It's by holding on to those values, standing up, even though you don't think you can win. Mrs. DeBose couldn't survive. She was dying, but she could at least die on her own terms. She could refuse to take the opium anymore, or morphine, I think it was, morphine. She can refuse to take the morphine. She can at least die with her mind clear, and she demonstrates a level of bravery. So Atticus thought it was important that Jem saw that. At this point, though, he thinks if Jem doesn't stand up and take responsibility for what he did, even though Atticus doesn't think he'll get in trouble, he still wants Jem to have to go through the courts to show that he wasn't guilty of murdering this person, to show that it was self-defense. So Atticus is looking at everything almost like as a teachable moment. You've probably heard teachers say that before, something happens, so Atticus wants to teach his son a lesson. Heck explains that that's not at all what happened, that Mr. Yule fell on his knife. He suggests that Mr. Yule probably stumbled on something and his own weight caused the knife to go deeply into his body. This isn't true, and Hecate knows it's not true. Atticus also knows it's not true. The problem is Heck knows what happened, and he's trying to give hints to Atticus as to the actual course of events, so that Atticus just drops the matter entirely. What actually happened is that when Boo Radley showed up, he stabbed Mr. Yule after pulling him off of Scout. So, and this is kind of hard to follow in the chapter 28 when Scout's explaining what happened, but if you remember, firstly, Jem's yanked off of Scout, his arm's broken, and he screams. So at that point, he's unconscious. So Jem's out of the picture at that point. Then Mr. Yule's squeezing Scout, trying to kill her by crushing her, right? At this point, someone grabs a hold of Mr. Yule, shoves him back, and then somewhere in this period of time, Mr. Yule's stabbed in the chest, and he dies. And then Scout notices him, like, wheezing for breath, probably stumbled away from the struggle, falls over, and dies. There's no way he fell on the knife, because when Scout found him, he was face up. Remember, she, like, mentioned he had stubble on the side of his face, so he dies face up. He didn't land on the knife, so there's no way he impaled himself. Also, Heck Tate, while they're talking, he pulls a knife out. He mentions it's not the knife that killed Mr. Yule, but he doesn't say where he got the knife. Most likely, Mr. Yule was carrying that knife on him, so he was armed with the switchblade that now Heck Tate has. Most likely, the knife that killed Mr. Yule got there because Boo brought it there. Remember, the tree where this whole event took place was really close to the Radley's house. So it's not like Boo Radley was out in the woods stalking the children. It's that this took place right by his house. When Jem and Scout were making noise, when they thought that the person following them was Cecil Jacobs, when they were yelling, that probably alerted Boo Radley, who came out of his house to see what was going on. He brought a kitchen knife with him. He saw what was transpiring. He defended the children, and he stabbed Mr. Yule. So the actual truth of the matter is that Mr. Yule was killed by Boo Radley. So even though Heck Tate knows this, though, he doesn't want to have to say that in court. And there's a couple of reasons for this. For one, Boo Radley's very reclusive, right? Also, he's not very popular with a lot of the townspeople. There are a lot of stories about him. If you remember, Stephanie Crawford says that she thinks she's seen him outside of her window at night staring at her menacingly. There are lots of stories the children tell, probably things they've heard their parents say. And he's not really a member of the community like a lot of the other people in the town are. So he's kind of something of an outcast and a recluse, right? He's like a hermit almost. But he's definitely innocent as a person. He's been mistreated. His parents did something to him at some point that's kind of damaged his psyche. Now he stays at home all the time. And then he saved 2 children, right? So he's an innocent. He kind of fits the whole criteria of being a Mockingbird. But even if he went to trial and he was found innocent for self-defense because he's rescuing 2 children from this like horrible person, and nobody liked Mr. Yule anyways, so it wouldn't probably be too difficult for Boo Radley to get off as this being self-defense. But Heck realizes all the attention that Boo would get from the court case would be too much for him to handle. He probably couldn't handle the stress of having people asking him what happened, coming to his house, offering condolences, or even going through the motions at a trial. That would just be too much for this man. And Heck, having been a part of what happened to Tom Robinson, knowing that Tom Robinson wasn't guilty, but having to still arrest the man, having to still take the man to trial and then to prison after he was found guilty, he's not willing to do it a second time. He's not willing to put another person through something like that when he has the power to help the person. He couldn't help Tom Robinson. Once Mr. Yule said, hey, that's the guy, he's the sheriff, he still has to arrest the guy, he still has to investigate. And then racism kind of just took over and doomed Tom. Here, though, he has a chance to spare Boo. He knows that he can just say that Mr. Radley fell on it, or not Mr. Radley, Mr. Yule fell on his own knife. It can be over. No one needs to know that any real involvement from Boo one way or the other, and the whole case can just kind of disappear. So that's what he wants to do. Once he verbalizes the notion of how bad this would be towards Boo Radley, then Atticus relents, and Atticus like gives Boo like a thank you, and then he goes inside and drops the matter entirely. So it's kind of just like a weird mindset where Atticus always has to do the right thing, but here he realizes doing the right thing and following the law to the letter isn't necessarily the same thing. So he's willing to let the matter drop at that point for the sake of Boo. Right, the last chapter is incredibly short as well. I think I summarized it in just 2 pages. The last chapter is really just Scout walking Boo home. So Boo doesn't talk a lot. He, I think, says one thing the entire novel. He asks Scout to guide him home. But before that happens, Scout's able to kind of tell what Boo wants just by looking at him. Now, Boo wants to leave, and she can tell that, and he also like seems like he wants something else, so she offers to take him in to say goodbye to Jem. So he goes inside, and she guides him inside, like kind of like escorting him through the house. He stands over Jem's bed, he touches his hair, and then he asks her to take him home. So that's kind of like his goodbye to Jem. Jem never actually gets to see Boo. They had never actually talked together. In fact, after this night, Scout never even gets to see Boo again. But this is as close as Boo and Jem get to speaking when he's passed out unconscious and Boo kind of like touches his hair. When Scout walks Boo home, she demonstrates that those lady qualities that Aunt Alexandria has been trying to instill in her. She kind of crooks her arm and like has Boo put his arm in her arm, and they go arm in arm down the street. While they're walking down the street, Scout mentions, like how she wishes people could see this, how like much of a gentleman he's being, and how he's just like a normal person. Eventually she gets him home to the porch. He goes straight inside. He doesn't say anything. He doesn't turn around. She never gets to see him again. They never speak again. But standing on the porch, she's finally able to like look at things from Boo's point of view. She has kind of like a flashback to like all the events that happened before, how the kids kind of tormented him by putting on their little plays, how things must look like the events of what have happened in the novel so far from his porch. So she's kind of looking at things from his perspective. She thinks about how he gave her all those gifts, the broken watch. I think there was a knife. There were the soap carvings, some coins, some gum, and then he also saved her. So she regrets not having given anything to him in return. This is similar to the feeling that Jem had chapters earlier when the tree where he had been leaving the gifts had been sealed. If you remember, he was going to leave a letter for whoever was giving them the gifts to thank that person. And then when Mr. Radley covered up that tree and Jem wasn't able to say thank you, he felt like some level of shame and regret, and he ended up crying. This is kind of the same feeling, but now Scout's having it. Remember, Scout's a lot younger, so it makes sense that it would take her longer to be able to step into someone else's point of view. She also shows that her curiosity and fears are completely faded. She's demonstrated some growth, and that now she can view Boo just as a neighbor, just as another person, and not as an object of her curiosity. So before, he was not quite a person to her, he was more of like an object, and now she's seeing him as an actual person. So when the novel ends, she goes home. She finds Atticus reading a book to Jem, or not out loud, but reading a book while he's watching Jem. She asks him to read to her. She mentions the book's scary, so initially Atticus says no, but Scout assures him that, she's not going to be scared. Books are the only thing scary. Real life's not scary. So even though she's been through this ordeal, she still refuses to say that she's frightened. So Atticus reads her a little bit of the book, and it's interesting, the book kind of parallels the novel To Kill a Mockingbird. In the book, she mentions that the gray ghost, the main character, was kind of scary. Everyone thought he did all these awful things, but they'd never seen him. And at the end of that book, when someone actually meets the gray ghost, they realize he's actually a nice person. He had never done any of those bad things. And that kind of parallels what had happened with Boo. In fact, she could have just as been easily talking about Boo Radley instead of the gray ghost character. they kind of parallel each other. So she's saying something about the book, but she might as well just be saying that about Boo, how everyone thought he was scary, everyone thought he did all these terrible things, but really he's a good person. Atticus at the very end repeats one of the novel's main themes, and that's that all people are basically good once you get to know them. And it's interesting that Atticus holds on to this worldview even in the face of Mr. Yule and everything that Mr. Yule did and tried to do that night. So he doesn't say all people are basically good. It's that most people are basically good. So I should probably change that word from all to most. He does say most at the end of the novel. And this theme's most clearly revealed in Boo. At the start of the story, he's a source of fear. People talk about him. The children have heard stories about him. People in town say he's done these awful things and he should be avoided. But in the end of the story, he's kind of like a hero. He saves 2 children. He does kill the guy, but the guy was trying to hurt 2 children. So I don't think anyone really is going to feel sorry for Mr. Yule in that regards. And then the story ends. So it's one of my favorite stories. You probably remember this story. For some time, most people have read To Kill a Mockingbird. It comes up throughout the rest of your educational career. Other books will be compared to it, other works of fiction, and actually events that happen in history will sometimes get referred to this book. I remember years ago when Obama was president, he actually had a commercial in front of To Kill a Mockingbird being aired on TV. He actually gave an intro to it. So it's one of those novels that's been read by almost everybody in America. Most people that you'll be able to speak to have read this story. So it's just one of those things it's good to have read, because then you can take part in conversations about it. There is a quiz if you go to the Google Classrooms. It's over all 3 chapters. It's still a fairly short quiz. I think it's 10 questions, just because those chapters are relatively short. I'm not going to give you guys a quiz over the entire novel. I'm just taking the quizzes that we've done for each individual chapter or each couple of chapters, and I'll count that. So it'll be a bunch of smaller quizzes rather than one large quiz. Also on Google Classrooms, I posted a clip from To Kill a Mockingbird, the movie. It's only 1 minute. It's the end of the novel. It cuts out the interaction between Scout and Atticus at the end and the whole conversation about the gray ghost, but it does have her coming back from dropping Boo Radley off, and it does have a lot of the lines from the novel, so it's worth watching. It's only a minute. There are also the answers to week 4 of the packet, so the language arts portion of the packet. Week 4, the answers are there, so if you already completed that, you can check your work. If you haven't already completed that, complete that first, and then use this to check your work. The summaries that I just went over are also posted there, so by now, nearly every chapter of To Kill a Mockingbird should have a summary posted on the Google website. If you need help with one of the chapters from before the whole quarantine situation started, I can make a summary for one of those chapters if need be. But you don't necessarily need those because there aren't quizzes for those on the website. We would have done that in class before the quarantine section. And then again, also just that quiz for chapters 29 through 31. And most of those answers you can find inside the summaries. I know I went really fast because I was trying to cram 3 chapters worth of info into a half hour. So if you have any questions, me going a little bit too fast, I'll be happy to answer those. If not, enjoy the rest of your day. Hopefully you guys have a good weekend coming up. Make sure you get those quizzes done. I noticed a lot of you guys have been completing the quizzes, so I've been going back and checking those and grading those periodically as well. Next week, we will be done with Kill a Mockingbird, so we will start a project. 7th grade's been doing projects for the last couple of weeks, and I'll give you guys a project next week, so you won't have to read something per se, but you get to make something and use your creativity for the last 2 weeks, hopefully. So that's all I have to say. I will talk to you all later. If you have any questions, feel free to post them either on Google classroom, email me, or leave a message in the stream. Even though I'm going to turn the stream off, you can still type comments in for I think like 20 minutes or so. So if you have any comments, feel free to type those in. Talk to you later. Bye.